Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. We do understand that we are the last session before the networking reception. So one of the things that we did make sure was that we will not run over in time. We are going to be presenting today on compliance is a program and not a project. My name is Michael Aminzade. I'm the VP of Managed Compliance Services of VikingCloud.
And my name's Chelsea Lopez. I'm an Enterprise Risk Director at FIS.
We're going to start off with complexity. Complexity in structures, by the nature that they have, means that they've got multiple different parts that are dependent on each other for their integrity. They also require a maintenance program to make sure that the structure can operate at peak performance. Let's look at the Golden Gate Bridge. This structure consists of 83,000 tons of steelwork. It spans 1.2 miles at the bridge level in length. It sits 220 feet above the sea level. It's got 80,000 miles of galvanized steel that makes up the cables. It's supported by two towers that stand 746 feet tall, and they weigh each of them 44,000 tons. This is a hugely complex structure. And do you know what? It's been standing for 86 years. So how does it manage to still survive? Right? It sits above a saltwater gateway, which has got lots of corrosion, and it's made of steel. Well, this is due to the maintenance program. It has got 6 ironworkers that work full-time alongside 34 painters, and they battle wind, sea air, fog, as well as being suspended high above the gate themselves to perform the work. They themselves are supported by a staff of electricians and road maintenance staff. This is all to make sure that when they finish one task, the next one is then ready to be done, and so on and so on. By the time they get to one end of the bridge, they're ready to go back to the beginning and then start again from a maintenance program. This is all to keep 40 million cars crossing the bridge every year. Now, with such a structure, the maintenance program is absolutely critical. If we just take a minute and think about what would happen if that maintenance program did not run. The structure would corrode, and there could be a catastrophic disaster, which could affect human life. If we treat compliance programs as individual projects, corrosion to our overall security posture and compliance can easily occur. Likewise, if we rush to an outcome in order to chase a compliance date, we could also have the same result. We can indirectly lead to weakening our defenses over time. So what we're going to cover today is why compliance should be treated as a program, not a project. We're going to look at some world views on regulatory compliance. We're also going to cover some synergies between compliance programs and also how you develop a mature compliance program and what are any impediments to success.
In just a few months, PCI DSS version 3.2.1 will be sunset and replaced with version 4. Similarly, a few years ago, CIS8 was released, and just last month, a draft of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 2 was released for comment with final publication anticipated next year. So with all these change, we can actually say the one guarantee in cybersecurity is change. And I would argue that not all change is bad. In any compliance program, there are multiple cogs, any of which could derail the whole program should one fail. For example, your identity and access management not following policy or not following the HR functions. Your patching may be sporadic. Your change management skips crucial steps or does not have all the right reports involved. Or your vulnerability management program may be weak. So with all of this in mind, you have to ask yourself, who is watching and controlling all of the moving parts or complexity on your road to compliance? And how are you able to avoid a sprint to being compliant by a fast approaching date?
So let's look at maintenance, right? Imagine that you are actually on a steep incline up one of those suspension cables that we saw before on the bridge. That is hugely steep for you to climb in a very short period of time. Likewise, if there's any marathon runners in the room, if we look at the Boston Marathon, at the 20-mile mark, just when you're hitting the wall, there is Heartbreak Hill. It is about 1.5 miles, and it is really steep for you to climb. If you're running your compliance program like a steep climb up a hill just before the compliance date, unfortunately, you may not reach the finish line in time. The longer you wait to make your run towards compliance as well, the steeper the hill gets. When you get to the top of the hill, you may also find out that you are not compliant because you didn't perform certain maintenance tasks when they needed to be performed during the previous cycle. There's another challenge as well. It's fatigue. So you've done a steep sprint up the top of the hill in order to chase that date, and then you and your team are exhausted from the audit fatigue that's taken to perform all those tasks. At that point, trying to then move past that compliance date into an ongoing maintenance program is extremely challenging. And if you have actually had a situation where you've not been able to achieve compliance, at that point, your team is fatigued, exhausted, and then the business pressure that is then applied is huge because you've got to get any of those weaknesses or remediation items done and get back to compliance and do a reassessment in order to fulfill any contractual obligations or fines. So Chelsea, how do we look to flatten this curve?
Well, with an overarching compliance program that includes accountable people, a sustainable risk management practices, and good communication, we've been able to flatten the curve and maintain a smoothed out compliance program with a little heightened scrutiny and activity around the assessment, but nothing that will make you feel like you are running up a hill to the point of exhaustion. Before we look into further to how we can plan and improve our compliance programs, let's take a look at worldview on regulatory compliance and see if that may help alter our personal opinion on the matter.
So at this point, I'm going to quickly bounce back to the bridge. So first of all, I want everyone to just take a minute and understand this. The bridge was designed in certain ways. It was actually designed with a downward movement of 10.8 feet. I'm 6'3", right? So that's quite a big movement downwards. But then it's also allowed for an upward movement of 5.8 feet. So that's 17 feet top to bottom. So Chelsea, if we both stood on each other's shoulders,
it would still be further than that.
Than both of us together, exactly. Right? So now what we want to do is we want to drive a fast-moving motor vehicle onto a platform that's going to fluctuate 17 feet whilst we drive across it. First of all, that sounds quite daunting. But why do we have confidence to do that? We have confidence to do that because of the design standards that it was built towards, the maintenance program that runs against it to keep the integrity, and it's engineered in order to be able to deal with that level of flexibility. So it's very interesting how compliance can change our view on items. If we look at the World Economic Forum, their Global Security Outlook report for 2023 said that business and cyber leaders support effective enforcement of regulatory requirements. 76% of business leaders and 70% of cyber leaders agreed that further enforcement of regulations would lead to an increase in their organization's cyber resilience. What has driven this? Well, it's the rise in state-sponsored attacks, it's the development of AI, it's also the future of computing in the quantum computing space. All of these things are driving organizations to be nervous about this. The World Economic Forum goes on to say that organizations believe that a correctly enforced regulation will raise the quality of their cybersecurity across not only their sector, but also their supply chains. I just want to make sure when we're talking about that, they're not asking for more regulation, they're asking for more enforcement of the current regulations that we have. The World Economic Forum, their reports have been building for multiple years. If we go back to 2012, the FTC sued a hotel chain for 3 data breaches that it had in 2 years. These breaches resulted in millions in fraud going on people's credit and debit cards, and there was a huge loss of personal data to Russia. The Financial Trade Commission said that if your clients are concerned about data security, and they should be, that you'll want to read their entire opinion on the situation. This actually was led by a court, right, in New Jersey that issued a ruling for 20 years for them to maintain reasonable security measures around the protection of cardholder data, and as part of that, they needed to complete a PCI-DSS annual assessment each year. The US is not alone on its move to maturing regulations. Japan, their Ministry for Trade and Industry required all organizations that worked with card data before the Olympics to be PCI-DSS compliant. And then since then, in 2022, they actually released an update to their credit card security guidelines. So the Japanese government is taking a hands-on approach to security. One of the cybersecurity towers that we have is enforcement of regulations. The world is moving in that way and getting on board with more enforcement. So Chelsea, how do we actually build a compliance program as strong as the Golden Gate Bridge?
Well, Michael, you've given us a lot of facts and figures about that bridge. And one thing I can say is the Golden Gate Bridge did not come about by accident. It was obviously designed and constructed to last. I would say the same is true of any cyber or compliance program. You may think, how hard is it to set up a program? Well, let's consider for a moment what you might be covering as part of your program. Above me, you can see a subset of the multiple regulations and compliance standards across the globe that are existing today. When planning your compliance program, you don't want to make the mistake of planning for each of these individual standards that you want or need to comply with. For example, an organization may have an ISO, PCI-DSS, and GDPR compliance requirements. Now, if these standards are siloed and each treated like an individual project, there's an incredible duplication of effort. So you may ask yourself, how do we organize these standards into a sustainable program? Well, after some extensive research, we were able to map the controls between standards, either directly, as you can see with the solid lines, or by domain, as you can see through the dotted lines. So revisiting my earlier example of an organization with ISO, PCI-DSS, and GDPR requirements, we can see that PCI-DSS and GDPR both map back to ISO 27001 controls. So an organization can use these mappings in the development of a compliance program where a single deliverable could cover all three standards. These mappings then rolled up to a common program are even more important when we're talking about assessment cycles of each standard. I know many people in this room have more than one standard to comply against. And when I think through at FIS, our team, we have ISO 27001 requirements. Well, those are on a 3-year cycle versus our annual PCI-DSS assessments and our compliance programs with those. So now you may ask yourself, where is your compliance program at today? Michael?
Well, in order to understand that, we have to look at maturity. So as part of compliance programs, one of the things that we need to make sure that we're building into them is continual improvement. We want to make sure that we can measure what we're doing, how is the program performing, and how is it moving and developing in alignment with our business. Now, in order to do that, we have to start somewhere. So we're going to start at the initial level. At this level, there is generally minimal or no process or procedure involved. Right? They are disorganized, they are being compliant, but that is likely to be achieved by individual efforts versus then actually the framework of the program, because it doesn't exist. Processes are not sufficiently designed or documented to allow them to be replicated, and the leadership team can see them as a tick mark or a means to an end. And generally, what you find in organizations is that employees are unaware of how their day-to-day activities can actually impact compliance. So Chelsea, after the initial level, what comes next?
Well, nice that you ask. Once we've gotten through the initial shock of compliance, I think that's really where we come from, we then can actually go up to a repeatable level. So at the repeatable level, we have basic project management techniques. They have been established. We have some successes that may be repeated, but we do not have defined or documented processes. At this level, we're often very reactive. And we find that staff are working compliance off the side of their desk while performing their regular duties. As such, assessments are painful. So we may ask, Michael, how do we move from repeating some successes actually into a program?
So in order to do that, we actually need to move to a program that is defined. So the next level, funnily enough, is the defined level. The processes and procedures at this point are designed to be in alignment with the compliance needs. They are well characterized and understood throughout the company and also supported by the management. At this stage, there is a compliance program and function in place that spans across the organization, understands its needs, understands its business objectives, and is able to support it. It often has got dedicated staff. They've got their jobs are defined against the roles that the compliance function needs to support. The data and the metrics that the program produces are actually shared with the appropriate stakeholders, which in turn allows data-driven decision makings and actually actionable intelligence of what's going on inside their compliance program. So now that we've got a defined program and we've got our metrics, how do we manage them, Chelsea?
Well, strangely enough, we actually call this the managed level. And at the managed level, we have taken those defined compliance program metrics and quantified them. We are able to do reporting on those up to management at some periodic frequency. These metrics can be viewed both holistically across the organization and also broken down by individual business units or products to see which are meeting their compliance objectives and which may have slipped. These metrics are also used as a thermometer to gauge the overall health of our compliance program. So we've achieved it. We're there. Michael, now that we have our managed program, we're done, right?
I wish that was the case, Chelsea. I think we all wish that was the case, right? That we were then done. But unfortunately, we're not, right? What then needs to happen for compliance programs is actually we need to continue to maintain them, we need to optimize them. The next level is optimization of the program. This requires fine-tuning of the program. Each metric in turn is looked at and understood. How can it evolve with the business needs? Right? The business organization will change. The technology landscape that they're working with will shift and evolve. So therefore, all of these metrics need to make sure that they stay current. Once targets are being met constantly, new and more focused or expanded target sets can actually be set up. This provides a path to continuous improvement of the program. Staying at a lower maturity level would be like building the Golden Gate Bridge with only 1/3 of the suspension ropes. I don't think anyone would trust to drive a car across that. But thankfully, for the 2 billion cars that have crossed the bridge, it wasn't designed that way. It's actually only ever closed 3 times, and they were for wind and weather, not for any structural issues. So Chelsea, what can prevent success?
Well, there are a number of things that will contribute to lack of success. One of which is maintaining the mindset of individual sprints rather than the marathon to compliance, which will actually lead us up Heartbreak Hill. Some of those impediments may include key activities being missed or scheduled right at that last minute. And in an attempt to meet a defined control, we see exceptions being addressed by compensating controls. And, an occasional gap doesn't just happen. They tend to become systemic, and that same compensating control may roll from assessment to assessment until even that compensating control is no longer enough. There's a few other obvious traps that we've run into. Lack of leadership support, insufficient funding or resource allocation, And probably the one that comes most to mind for me is not planning for changes in the standards. As we all know, PCI-DSS version 4 was published last year, and it gave organizations 24 to 36-month transition to meet those controls. So whether it was a small change that was immediately implemented, or it's one of our future dated controls, we had that time lane. What we have seen, though, is some organizations have still waited till the last minute to do a full examination of those changes in the requirements, and not realizing that they may require additional funding or resources to meet the controls, thus setting themselves up for Heartbreak Hill. So, Michael, despite these challenges, how do we maintain an overall program?
So for success, I think we've covered today that compliance needs to be treated as a program, not a project. We want to avoid sprinting up Heartbreak Hill, especially when you're exhausted and it can jeopardize ongoing compliance. It's critical that the curve is smoothed. As part of your program, you need to combine all of your compliance requirements, find synergies, reduce duplication, utilize the tools that are readily available inside your organization, provide actionable intelligence and metrics to your leadership, clearly define the roles and responsibilities and educate your staff. Build the program for continuous improvement so that it can stay current. After all, if we're not prepared to drive a car over a bridge that hasn't been maintained, why would we be willing to store precious data on systems that aren't either? So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much, everyone, for the time. We look forward to seeing you in the networking reception. We will be at booth 45, VikingCloud booth. And thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.